As I said, this is the third of the 6 lectures. And in this lecture, Professor Neiman will be talking to the topic of freedom fighter or terrorist, John Brown and the American Civil War. So I think probably you're all familiar with the arrangements. Professor Neiman will deliver her lecture. Then I'll come back and thank you in the proper way. Maybe people may need to leave. But then at a certain point, we can also have questions and answers up to the end of the allotted time, which I think is 6:45. So I won't delay the proceedings anymore. Over to Professor Neiman. Thank you.
Thank you, Jo. And thank you for waiting. Sorry about the technical hiccups. Can everyone hear me, also in the back? Yes? So I suspect few of you will know much about John Brown, though his execution provoked essays in, at least, the Glasgow Herald, the Aberdeen Journal, and the Caledonian Mercury. But that was in 1859, and the Glasgow Herald's main concern was to lessen Scotland's dependency on the cotton-growing states of America. This was not, alas, a call for a morally driven boycott, but a warning that those supplies could become perilous and threaten the Scottish economy, which should, the author concludes, cultivate a cotton trade with our possessions. I was going to jog your memory by playing the Battle Hymn of the Republic, which most of you will have heard, if not in the wonderful version by Paul Robeson, but we're having tech problems today. So I won't play it for you. I urge you to look it up on Spotify. There's several versions. Don't get the one that starts with the drum beats. The song was so named because it was sung by thousands of soldiers fighting for the Union and against slavery in the American Civil War. Let me read you the opening of a sermon preached by Reverend Moncure Conway in Ohio 2 days after Brown was hung for leading an insurrection to free slaves at Harpers Ferry, Virginia. Conway himself was born into a slave-holding family in Virginia, but became an abolitionist while studying at Harvard Divinity School. His sermon began, "Is John Brown a hero? It will one day be told, to prove the stupidity of this age, that such a question was asked by some men, that there were eyes so dull they could not see, in a man dying for religious principle, anything more than a fanatic, madman, or traitor." End quote. Now, Conway's prophecy was wrong. To this day, there's little agreement, at least among white people, about whether Brown was a hero, a fanatic, or a lunatic. My interest in Brown was sparked over a decade ago by the claim that accompanied the wave of suicide terrorism, one man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter. It implied that everybody's views on the matter are authentic and therefore equally valid. Real deliberation on the subject is thus as rational as flipping a coin. Knowing next to nothing about Brown at the time, I approached him without clear convictions, thinking he'd be a good test case for the possibility of giving reasons one way or another. I had no idea that even before his execution, his case was already the subject of some of the most thoughtful deliberation in American philosophy. Like most vaguely informed Americans, well, many of us pay more attention to European history than to American history. It was certainly true of me for a long time. I was raised on the extreme ambivalence to Brown, which counts as objective history. In a recent review of several new books on the subject, historian James McPherson expresses the prevailing tone, quote, "Was Brown a terrorist who killed innocent victims, or a hero martyr who struck a mighty blow against the accursed institution of slavery? His body has lain a moldering in its grave for almost 150 years, and yet there is today no more consensus on the answers to these questions than in 1859. The refusal to pronounce judgment may be part of normal academic fence-sitting, but it shouldn't be an avenue that's open to philosophy. My reflections here are partly an attempt to question the unwritten non-interference pact that exists between philosophers and historians, leading historians to eschew moral judgment and philosophers to refrain from discussing historical questions. But I also believe that Brown's story itself raises a moral demand. Americans are his heirs in many ways, and his life raises questions we have yet to fully answer. Poets from Stephen Vincent Benet, the author of John Brown's Body, which has been called, rightly, the American Iliad, to Nobel laureate Bob Dylan, believe we're still living in the shadows of the Civil War. Many causes made the war seem increasingly unavoidable, but Brown was the spark, or meteor, according to Herman Melville, that radicalized North and South, convincing both sides of the truth of the last words he wrote on his way to the gallows. I, John Brown, am now quite certain that the crimes of this guilty land will never be purged away, but with blood. A few years earlier, Uncle Tom's Cabin became America's first bestseller and was widely read abroad. Queen Victoria is said to have wept over it, and the usually ironic Heinrich Heine praised it to the skies. Its author, Harriet Beecher Stowe, performed a masterpiece of consciousness raising, but her book was not the first description of the horror of life as a slave. Abolitionists held meetings, raised money, and established the Underground Railroad. But like most of us here, most of what they did was talk. The talk was not cheap. Even in the North, preachers lost their pulpits for open abolitionist preaching, and one white man was lynched in Illinois for printing an abolitionist paper. But while they might rouse the right passions, they did not temper the wrong ones, and the situation grew increasingly dire. Before the mid-19th century, abolitionists had been few in number. Most Northerners were content to view slavery with chaste disdain and sometimes open approval, as long as it took place at a distance. What roused the North were three decisions that meant the question could no longer be avoided by staying north of the Mason-Dixon line, the line between Virginia and Maryland, which marked the border between slave and free states, although there were slaves in the North as well. The first was a fugitive slave law passed in 1850 that allowed slave catchers to kidnap those slaves who succeeded in escaping north, as well as any unlucky African-American freedmen they might round up. 1857 brought the Supreme Court decision over Dred Scott, which asserted that blacks could not be citizens or have any civil rights. The most important, however, was probably the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854, which nullified earlier legislation restricting slavery to the South and declared slavery a matter of popular sovereignty to be decided by vote of the majority of inhabitants of each territory. So long as slavery could be contained in the South, those who were opposed to it cherished hope that it might die out peacefully as Northern practices spread through an industrializing world. Those hopes were undermined by the realities of the cotton industry. Cotton was the 19th century's most traded product, as vital to American and British economies as oil is to our economies today. The US produced 60% of the world's cotton, and cotton made up 60% of US exports. The states in which it was picked were the wealthiest in the land. But the white gold, as it was called, quickly exhausted even the fertile soil of Mississippi. The fortunes it made for the slavers could not be maintained unless cotton production was expanded to the vast western territories, one reason why Native Americans were increasingly driven further away from their original homes. And since no one was prepared to endure the harsh conditions involved in planting and picking cotton unless they were forced to do so, slavers were determined to conquer the West, which would have given the slave states a majority in the Union, giving them political power to destroy what restrictions on slavery remained. The immediate consequence of the Kansas-Nebraska Act was a flood of immigration to Kansas. Slaveholders from Missouri moved over the border in the hope of creating a majority, while abolitionists volunteered to stake out claims there in order to defeat the extension of slavery. Among the latter were 5 sons of John Brown. Brown himself was born in 1800 in Connecticut, son of a small farmer and grandson of a captain in the Continental Army, all devout Calvinists. Like his father, Brown was an abolitionist from the start. His passion for the cause kindled at the age of 12 when he witnessed the mistreatment of a slave boy in the house where he was lodged. Most unusually for the era, Brown's father raised him to believe in the equality of all people under God, and the lesson was passed on to Brown's own children. As Frederick Douglass and others later noted, Brown's family was the only white one where blacks were invited to share supper as a matter of course. The suppers were not luxurious. Brown struggled to support what would eventually be 20 children. 2 wives, his first one died rather early, but still 20 children. He tried his hand as a tanner, shepherd, small farmer, and surveyor, going bankrupt twice in the effort to put the family on a solid enough footing to pursue his real calling. For the memorial service for Elijah Lovejoy, the Presbyterian minister murdered by a mob after his newspaper denounced the lynching of a black man in Missouri, Brown rose and addressed the assembly, "Here before God in the presence of these witnesses, from this time I consecrate my life to the destruction of slavery." Brown returned home and asked his wife and older sons to kneel and make the same vow. The family was active in harboring and transporting fugitive slaves to Canada, as well as supporting a small farming settlement of free blacks on the home they carved out of the wilderness of western New York. But the Kansas-Nebraska Act offered an opportunity for action with wider consequences. Brown initially stayed behind in pursuit of his longtime plan to strike at slavery through the Allegheny Mountains that run from north to south on the eastern seaboard. But he urged his sons to answer the call for Free State volunteers to homestead in Kansas, and 5 of them set out in 1854. The journey was awful. The 2 brothers who traveled by steamboat described the other passengers as permanently drunk and brandishing Bowie knives. When Jason Brown's 4-year-old son died of a cholera outbreak, the family disembarked to bury him in a thunderstorm, only to find that the pro-slavery ship's captain had pulled off deliberately before they could reboard. They continued by stagecoach, but hearing their northern accents, local Missouri farmers refused to sell them food. Weeks later, they reached the camp the other brothers had struck in Kansas. It was called Bleeding Kansas, but it was already a civil war. While the Free Staters were in the majority, they were struggling to survive on the rough Kansas plain under constant harassment from pro-slavery farmers who would ride out from their homes in Missouri, ransack and burn the settlers' towns, steal their livestock, and occasionally shoot them dead. The object was to terrify the Free Staters into returning home before the popular referendum on slavery. Both North and South viewed Kansas as decisive ground. John Brown left for Kansas a year after his sons, expecting to bring provisions and weapons to strengthen the Free Staters' hands. What he found on arriving was a couple of tents and a campfire, his children sick with malaria, their crops spoiled by storm, and their animals untended. After burying the body of Jason's son, which he had stopped in Missouri to exhume, Brown built his family 2 log cabins and made provisions for the winter. Context is crucial for understanding the Potawatomi massacre Brown commanded in 1856, the main source of his reputation as a terrorist. Terrorism involves the use of violence outside the law, including what laws exist to govern war. Now, Brown held slavery to be an undeclared war by one part of the population against the other, and believed that violent resistance to it was a matter of calling the slaveholders to reckoning. But whether or not they agree with that, historians agree that the vast majority of violence in Kansas, 75% by recent accounting, was committed by pro-slavery forces. They were often in collusion with the fraudulent government installed by President Franklin Pierce. Nor was the Kansas-Nebraska territory the only part of the country which was notable for the absence of law. After making a speech in Congress called The Crime Against Kansas, the abolitionist senator from Massachusetts, Charles Sumner, was nearly beaten to death with a gold-headed cane by South Carolina Senator Preston Brooks on the Congress floor. Following the Congress is difficult today, but it has a history. Following the bloody beating, many senators took to carrying weapons in Congress. Brooks' constituents sent boxes of canes to demonstrate their support. One was inscribed, "Use knockdown arguments." The news of Sumner's beating was Brown's last straw. "I am eternally tired of hearing the word caution," he exclaimed. "It is nothing but a word of cowardice." The next night, he commanded a vigilante party of 7 men, including 4 of his sons, who used broadswords to kill 5 neighbors who'd been active in pro-slavery circles. Historian David Reynolds argues there was appropriateness in Brown's using terror to avenge the sack of the town of Lawrence and the caning of Sumner, typically Southern acts of violence met by characteristic Northern timidity. Sumner's helpless passivity before Brooks' sadistic attack was not unlike the inability of the Lawrence citizens to resist the invading border ruffians. This, by the way, I think it is still in the Kansas State House. Brown's role in the Potawatomi massacre came to light and discussion much later. Aided by local Native Americans with whom the Browns were friendly, the vigilantes avoided capture, so that Brown's initial fame in Kansas was made in the much less bloody battle at Osawatomie. There, Brown led off most of the pro-slavery soldiers he captured with a lecture explaining that their cause was at odds with the Declaration of Independence. His small force did not prevent the Missouri regiments from sacking the town, but he was considered to have won such a moral victory that Senator John J. Ingalls later recalled, "It was our Thermopylae, and John Brown was our Leonidas with his Spartan band." More popularly, he was thereafter known as Old Osawatomie Brown, and it was under that name that he was captured at Harpers Ferry. Though some debate remains about just what Brown intended, it was certainly not what happened. He had studied guerrilla warfare in many contexts, focusing particularly on the slave insurrection in Haiti, as well as the life of the Maroons who escaped from slavery in Jamaica. Brown hoped that by capturing the federal armory at Harpers Ferry, he could ignite a slave rebellion which would create a provisional state in the Alleghenies, gaining strength by raiding plantations and freeing slaves until the system finally fell. What Brown lacked most were soldiers. Frederick Douglass refused Brown's plea to join them, as did others. In the end, the band contained 6 black and 13 white volunteers, including 3 of Brown's sons. I have to tell you, I have been there. It is now a national park in West Virginia, and it's unbelievably small. For a building that had enormous historical importance, one is shocked when one sees it. Actually looks larger in this contemporary drawing than it is. They were initially successful in capturing the army and a number of hostages, including Colonel Lewis Washington, a small but wealthy planter who was the great-grandnephew of the first US president. Brown wanted his name as well as his weapons, a sword given to George Washington by Frederick the Great for what Brown thought would be the moral effect for our cause. Brown relished the symbolic justice. George Washington founded a nation that fought for liberties it denied to black people. Now black people were guarding his descendant with iron pikes. The hope was to hold the hostages long enough for Brown's party to take the munitions and return to the mountains, strengthened by the scores of slaves they hoped would rally to the cause. But the slaves didn't rally, the retreat was delayed, at one point by Brown's decision to organize a large breakfast from the local hotel for the hostages, a breakfast that Colonel Washington, among others, didn't eat. But the hostages later testified that they were treated with great courtesy. By the second day, News of the raid had raised just not local militia, but federal troops under the command of Robert E. Lee, who would later be the commander of the Confederate armies. The battle was brutal, the battle for Harpers Ferry, was brutal, but its outcome was never in doubt. With Washington's sword in his hand, one son dead, another dying by his side, John Brown was captured when federal troops bashed in the armory door. A belt buckle seems to have prevented Brown's own wounds from being fatal. John Brown would have called it providence. For though he'd planned for the raid's success, he was astute enough to know that its failure might be more effective. The military battle over Harpers Ferry lasted barely 2 days. The moral battle took up the 2 months between Brown's capture and his execution, and the latter was as spectacularly a success as the former was a defeat. Initially, the outcome of the moral battle was far from certain. The prominent abolitionist William Lloyd Garrison originally called the raid a misguided, wild, and apparently insane, although well-intended effort. All but one of Brown's secret six supporters rushed to distance themselves from him, literally. With good reason to fear being tried as accomplices, 4 fled the country while 1 took refuge in an insane asylum. Frederick Douglass, who sailed to England, later wrote, "I've always been more distinguished for running than for fighting, and tried by the Harpers Ferry test, I'm most miserably deficient in courage." But Douglass was too hard on himself. As the only black among Brown's prominent supporters, he was the only one with a price on his head and no chance whatsoever of getting a fair trial. And then came the moment when those of us who are trained in philosophy can be proud of our profession. When even abolitionists who knew Brown well were prepared to spurn him, Thoreau and Emerson took up the cause with an intensity that surprised those who knew them. Emerson's wife and Thoreau's mother had been far more engaged in the abolitionist cause than either of the writers, one of whom was known as the revered but aloof Plato of America, the other as the brilliant but peculiar hermit of Concord. They shared a patrician suspicion of anything that looked like a political movement. Yet, as abolitionist Wendell Phillips later wrote, the crowning honor of Emerson is that after talking about heroism for so many years, when the hero John Brown came, he knew him. Thoreau, who famously lived at Walden Pond, was the first to take an unambivalent stand. 2 weeks after the raid, against the advice of a Concord anti-slavery committee, who thought it would be extreme and impolitic, Thoreau gave an impassioned speech in which he called Brown a man of rare common sense and directness of speech as of action, a transcendentalist above all, a man of ideas and principles. For Thoreau, Brown had practiced the highest form of civil disobedience. In a comparison crafted to engage his audience at Concord, he called Brown more important than the heroes of Lexington and Concord, which was the beginning of the American Revolution. They, said Thoreau, could bravely face their country's foes, but he had the courage to face his country itself when she was in the wrong. The speech was repeated several times, and the best lines were widely reported in the news. Brown's own behavior at his highly public trial reinforced Thoreau's picture. Carried into court on a stretcher, the wounded Brown spoke with calm and force that impressed even his Southern opponents, and declared himself prepared to die for the principles that were as enshrined in the Bible as in the Declaration of Independence. Thoreau's defense and Brown's demeanor were decisive for Emerson, who was the most influential, intellectual, and most highly paid speaker in America. Even more importantly, his Concord poem recalling the shot heard round the world left his patriotic credentials unimpeachable, associating him forever with the best ideals of the American Revolution. Emerson was normally reserved about contemporary social questions, but when he did come out, wrote the poet Walt Whitman, it was with the power of an avalanche. 5 days after Brown's speech to the court in Virginia, Emerson made a speech in Boston. The prospect of Brown's execution, Emerson said, was, quote, the reductio ad absurdum of slavery, when the governor of Virginia is forced to hang a man whom he declares to be a man of the most integrity, truthfulness, and courage he's ever met. In the phrase that was echoed across the nation, Emerson said that hanging Brown would make the gallows glorious as the cross. That speech was called Courage. His second speech on Brown, delivered at a memorial service 10 days later, was called Courage. After the most prominent moral philosopher in the nation compared Brown to Jesus, the tide was turned. By the time Brown was executed a few weeks later, the bulk of Northern public opinion regarded him as the hero of 1859, in the words of a banner gracing a memorial service in Cleveland, Ohio. 1,400 mourners attended, and the numbers were similar across the North. His coffin was carried to the New York family farm in a ceremony that lasted days. On the day of the execution, church bells tolled in much of New England. Black businesses closed their doors. Of the thousands of offers of support sent to his family, the most moving one was surely one written by women who called themselves your colored sisters to his wife just before the execution and published in the Weekly Anglo-African. Tell your dear husband, then, that henceforth you shall be our own. We are a poor and despised people, almost forbidden by the oppressive restrictions of the free states to rise to the higher walks of lucrative employments, toiling early and late for our daily bread. But we hope, and we intend, by God's help, to organize in every free state and in every colored church a band of sisters to collect our weekly pennies and pour it lovingly in your lap. God will help us, for he's the judge of the widow and the father of the fatherless. I get goosebumps every time I read that letter. Now, here's a word about these portraits which are interestingly apocryphal. They do not portray anything that actually happened. When asked if he wanted a clergyman to accompany him to the gallows, Brown refused. He didn't believe that any clergyman who accepted slavery, and that was what was available in Virginia, could be a real Christian. He said he'd prefer to be accompanied by barefoot slave children and their mothers. Of course, security was so heavy they wouldn't have gotten near the jailhouse. But several paintings and stories read his wish into the record. I began to read about Brown because I thought he was a case of moral complexity. As the tenor of my remarks will have made apparent, the more I learned about Brown, the less complex I found the case. Thoreau and Emerson and those who followed had answered most questions. It was a near-perfect marriage of theory and practice. As Wendell Phillips remarked after the reprinting of Brown's court speech, quote, "Why, men say he should remember that lead is wasted in bullets and is much better made into type. He fired one gun, and he's made use of the New York Herald and Tribune for a fortnight." Even in liberal Massachusetts, words like Thoreau's and Emerson's were not spoken lightly. Both men received death threats, famous as they were, and would doubtless have received more were it known that they not only held speeches and raised money for Brown's family, but broke the law by helping one of his co-conspirators escape to Canada. Emerson lent the horse, and Thoreau drove the wagon. So without the work of a couple of neo-Kantians in Concord, John Brown's soul would have been stopped in its tracks. At the same time, the defense of John Brown was transcendentalism's finest hour. Without it, their praise of self-reliance and civil disobedience can take on the air of the fine disdain for the masses that a Harvard education and residence in the most beautiful town in New England permit. Their writings offer reasons, and I want to turn to arguments that can be mined from those writings to answer the question, was Brown a hero? W.B. Du Bois' biography, John Brown, which I highly recommend to anyone who's interested in Brown, it was Du Bois's favorite of all of his books, declared that Brown did not use argument, he was himself an argument. As Emerson said at a meeting to raise funds for Brown's family, he is so transparent that all men see him through. After describing the complexities of the war in Kansas, Du Bois wrote, "The man who most clearly saw the real crux of the conflict, most definitely knew his own convictions, and was readiest at the crisis for decisive action, was a man whose leadership lay not in his office, wealth, or influence, but in the white flame of his utter devotion to an ideal." That devotion made Emerson and Thoreau regard him as a true transcendentalist. In turn, it sparked devotion in most everyone who knew him, from his own children to the unlettered slave who turned to die with him, to the governor of Virginia who was opposed to everything for which Brown stood. To quote Lorraine Daston, "We do not postpone our admiration for such lives until we've identified the moral rule which they instantiate. If anything, admiration flows in the opposite direction. The particular life invigorates the maxim." George Eliot, to whose thoughts about heroism I shall turn next week, wrote that a hero is someone who is willing to die for an idea. A fanatic is willing to kill for it. I would add, a hero is willing to live for an idea, indeed to do everything possible to live for and with an idea before concluding it is necessary to die for it. Brown's defenders, and there were many, described his character in acts great and small throughout his life. All stressed that he lived in private what he preached in public. Here's Frederick Douglass's report after their first meeting. "He observed that I might have noticed the simple manner in which he lived, adding that he had adopted this method in order to save money to carry out his purposes. This was said in no boastful tone, for he felt that he had delayed already too long, and had no room to boast either his zeal or his self-denial. Had some men made such a display of rigid virtue, I should have rejected it as affected, false, and hypocritical. But in John Brown, I felt it to be as real as iron or granite." Despite his lack of formal education, Brown had the presence which moved the best minds in America. One abolitionist called it moral magnetism. After a lecture Brown gave in Concord, Bronson Alcott wrote, "He tells his story with surprising simplicity and sense, impressing us all deeply by his courage and religious earnestness. Our best people listen to his words. Emerson, Thoreau, Judge Hoare, my wife, and some of them contribute in aid of his plans without asking particulars. Such confidence does he inspire with his integrity and abilities." Unitarian preacher Thomas Higginson described him in part, "I saw before me a man whose mere appearance and bearing refuted in advance some of the strange perversions which have found their way into many books and which have wholly missed the type to which he belonged. In his thin, worn, resolute face, there were signs of a fire which might wear him out, and practically did so, but nothing of pettiness or baseness, and his talk was calm, persuasive, and coherent. I never could find in him a trace of mere ambition. He lived, as he finally died, absolutely absorbed in one idea." End quote. The idea that all human beings are created equal governed his life. This idea was proclaimed in the Bible, in Roman natural law, and in America's founding document. From it should follow that slavery is a great evil, although both the Romans and the American founding fathers found arguments that allowed civic law to take precedence over natural law, which abhors slavery. Brown reversed that order to demand that natural law take precedence over the laws of the land. Apart from the hours he devoted to the business of supporting his large family, Brown spent his life experimenting with the most effective way of fighting it and every form of discrimination based on racism. His very last words recorded what he came to regard as mistaken. "I had, as I now think vainly, flattered myself that without very much bloodshed, the crimes of this guilty nation might be purged." But his first acts were as bloodless as they were radical, beginning with offering his church seats to fugitive slaves in Ohio, an act his daughter described as a bombshell, which eventually resulted in the family's exclusion from the church. Brown described himself rarely, but when he did, he often described his own patience. Quote, "Young men must learn to wait. Patience is the hardest lesson to learn. I've waited for 20 years to accomplish my purpose." End quote. Brown tried every nonviolent means available in order to do so. Even before setting out on the fateful raid at Harpers Ferry, he gave his men this final order. "And now, gentlemen, let me impress this one thing on your minds. You all know how dear life is to you and how dear life is to your friends. And in remembering that, consider that the lives of others are as dear to them as yours are to you. Do not, therefore, take the life of anyone if you can possibly avoid it, but if it is necessary to take life in order to save your own, then make sure work of it." End quote. The Civil War, which began in Kansas, taught him, however, that slavery could not be ended by moral persuasion, for the slaveholders would not give up their property without a fight. Yet for all that the transcendentalists may have thrilled to a man whose whole life was directed by an idea, we may find the thought of such a person forbidding. Isn't that sort of single-mindedness the mark of a fanatic? One who might live and die for humankind while remaining remote from the human? Most of the photos we have, there are not many, of Brown are not simply imposing, they can seem almost menacing. After his famed battles in Kansas, Brown's very name could cause fear. Ordered by the governor of Kansas to capture him dead or alive, the U.S. Marshal answered, "If I try to capture John Brown, it'll be dead, and I'll be the one that'll be dead." At Osawatomie, after all, Brown's band of 15 men compelled a force of 400 to retreat. Many admired the integrity and purposefulness of the small companies he recruited and trained, requiring all to forswear alcohol, profane language, and immoral character. "I would rather have the smallpox, yellow fever, and cholera all together in my camp than a man without principles," he told a New York Tribune reporter in Kansas. It was a mistake, Brown continued, to view bullies as the best fighters. With a dozen men of good principle who respect themselves, he could oppose any 100 such men as those Buford ruffians. The journalist wrote he had never seen such men. They were not earnest, but earnestness incarnate. Even his enemies could not suppress their admiration. Despite later caricatures of Brown as Satan, every Southerner who had direct contact with him was impressed. Governor Wise of Virginia, the jailer who oversaw him, Stonewall Jackson, who happened to be present at the execution, all saw him as exemplifying the honor which was a Southern gentleman's pride. But you may ask, earnestness incarnate? Even those who admired him often said he had the air of an Old Testament prophet. For ordinary mortals, a figure of awe, but perhaps not of love. Integrity is admirable, but can this degree of integrity be compatible with humanity, or are iron-willed angels required to maintain it? Yet Thoreau wrote, "No man has appeared in America as yet who loved his fellow man so well and treated him so tenderly." Countless descriptions of Brown reveal a wide streak of tenderness. Though not a man of humor, Brown was not the sort whose dedication to humanity precluded attention to the human beings around him. His extraordinary energy was not only put to building log cabins and cooking cornbread for his troops, but to staying up all night with feverish babies. One daughter recalled Brown's tenderness towards his old father as well as his wife, describing it this way, quote, "When any of the family were sick, he did not often trust watchers to care for the sick one, but sat of himself and was like a tender mother. At one time, he sat up every night for 2 weeks while mother was sick, for fear he would oversleep if he went to bed and then the fire go out and she'd take cold. When one girl was sick, he spared no pains in doing all that medical skill could do for her with the tenderest care and nursing. He sat up nights to keep the fire from going out and to relieve mother from the constant care which she had through the day. He used to walk with the child and sing to her so much that she soon learned his step. He noticed a change in her one morning and told us he thought she would not live through the day. Came home several times to see her. A little before noon, he came home and looked at her and said, "She's almost gone." She heard him speak, open her eyes, put up her little wasted hands with such a pleading look that he lifted her up from the cradle with the pillows she was lying on and carried her until she died. He was very calm, closed her eyes, folded her hands, and laid her in the cradle. When she was buried, Father broke down completely and sobbed like a child. Children were inevitably drawn to him. Reports of his talks at the homes of clandestine supporters often mention children clambering over his knees. His tenderness also extended to animals. His daughter remembered him stopping work to kill a snake that was threatening a nest of baby birds and staying up all night to feed a sick lamb with a teaspoon. For Emerson and Thoreau, the ease and attention with which he moved in the natural world was a sign of his authenticity. He was also sensitive to beauty. He loved music and sang a good part himself and could be brought to tears by it, said one. Lying sleepless in a Kansas prairie, he watched the stars and spoke of the grandness of the heavens. The last words he spoke as he sat on his coffin in the cart which took him to the gallows were, "This is a beautiful country. I've not cast my eyes on it before." His graciousness towards his jailers, thanking them for their kindness and giving them his Bible and his watch, impressed the nation, though perhaps less as signs of humanity than of a superhuman Christian spirit. The calm firmness with which he faced death lent him a nobility few could resist. His speech during the trial, the letters he wrote during 2 months in prison, his refusal to plead for his life or agree to a rescue were broadcast throughout the nation. Southerners fumed that he should have been swiftly court-martialed and shot without trial to prevent him from making what they called incendiary speech for effect. From the South's perspective, this was perspicacious. Emerson later placed his speech to the court along with the Gettysburg Address as the two greatest American speeches. "Where is our professor of belles lettres or of logic or rhetoric who can write so well?" asked Thoreau. Brown's words, Thoreau continued, were his Sharp's rifles, more important than any weapons used at Harpers Ferry, and they reveal that the one great rule of composition is to speak the truth. The truth that Thoreau and Emerson saw expressed in Brown's words and deeds was just this. Between slavery and anti-slavery, there was no middle ground. For Emerson, this was a truth of nature, older than the Shenandoah Mountains. If all are created equal, as both the Bible and the Declaration of Independence insisted, no human being could have a right to own another. In fact, Brown was considerably ahead of the conquered intellectuals who would come to support him. In the 1830s, as Brown was working to create an interracial settlement in the Alleghenies, Emerson was writing in his diary that neither the African, the Irish, the American Indian, nor the Chinese would ever occupy a very high place in the human family. The Transcendentalists opposed slavery, but not racism. Brown's argument in the courtroom pushed them closer to the egalitarianism he championed with the logic of the Golden Rule. As Brown said in court, had he intervened on behalf of the rich, the powerful, the intelligent, the so-called great, or on behalf of any of their friends, it would have been all right, and every man in this court would have deemed it an act worthy of reward rather than punishment. Freeing white people from torture and bondage would have won praise. Freeing African Americans was an act of treason. Brown acted, as he said, in sympathy with the oppressed and wronged that are as good as you and as precious in the sight of God. Now, when Brown arrived from Kansas to Boston in 1857, he'd never read a word of the Transcendentalists, but his view that individual conscience surpassed laws and majorities resonated with their thought. Thoreau's civil disobedience argued that we're obliged to disobey unjust laws. Emerson's self-reliance valorized the unswerving self-trust which the Transcendentalists and everyone else recognized in Brown. In 1854, Bostonians had rioted as federal troops enforced the fugitive slave law by returning the fugitive Anthony Burns to the South in chains. Neither Emerson nor Thoreau participated in the protests, but Emerson wrote that in a land where rescuing slaves counts as treasonous, all law is turned upside down. The government itself is treason. When the public fails in its duty, private men must take its place. The Concord philosophers were thus prepared for the appearance of a private man like Brown, who upheld a higher law than the law of the land. One historian argues they were prepared years earlier by Carlyle's book on heroism and his biography of Oliver Cromwell, venerated as a devout Puritan who resisted tyranny. Brown came to Boston in search of money, not ideas. He had plenty of the latter, and he hoped that the large number of abolitionists there would fund his plan to strike a mortal blow against slavery in the southern mountains. The Transcendentalists thrilled to hear of the Kansas exploits of a man who'd put the ideas towards which they were groping into practice. Emerson invited Brown to stay at his home and arranged for him to lecture at the Cambridge Town Hall, where Brown convinced some listeners to give money for the plans he never entirely elaborated. Yet even if the evils of slavery were inarguable and its tenacity so strong that only force could break it, wasn't it mad to think it could be overthrown by a band of 22 men at arms? Whether from the North or South, almost all the early reports of the raid on Harpers Ferry called Brown insane, a charge that was offered to prevent his execution. Brown indignantly rejected it. True, he'd been captured alive, a failure he blamed on his slowness in retreating from the armory. Apart from that, the plan had initially functioned like clockwork, freeing and arming a number of slaves and taking their masters hostage at the cost of only one life. But the raid was subject to the kinds of contingencies that can foil even well-made plans. Wagons of arms that didn't arrive before Brown's troops were encircled, the illness that prevented some supporters from getting to Virginia at all. The most notable of these was Harriet Tubman, who Brown called General Tubman, one of the best and bravest persons on this continent. Still, it's clear that the raid, far from being the product of rage or impatience, was the result of more than a decade of careful preparation. 12 years earlier, Brown revealed the outlines of his plan to Frederick Douglass, the most prominent black abolitionist of his day, in the hopes of convincing him to join. Brown believed that a general insurrection would be so bloody as to defeat his purposes. His object, rather, was to destroy the money value of slave property by making that property insecure. This could be done, he thought, with a small band of 25 handpicked men stationed in the wild mountains who would regularly descend to the fields and persuade the boldest of slaves to join them. Some would be sent north via the Underground Railroad, others would stay and help the force enlarge. His knowledge of the mountains would enable his men to survive there, with occasional raids on surrounding farms. His band would have the advantages all guerrilla forces possess. Brown's confidence was supported by careful study of the local geography as well as of military history. During his one visit to Europe, he visited Waterloo to assess Napoleon's mistakes on the battlefield and toured fortifications in Germany and Switzerland. And in choosing Harpers Ferry as a place to strike his blow at slavery, he was not only aiming at a federal armory where hundreds of weapons were stored, but a town at the confluence of the Potomac and Shenandoah rivers that was located so centrally it changed hands between North and South 13 times during the war. When he laid out his strategy to those he hoped would fund it, He answered questions past midnight till they concluded, quote, that every difficulty had been foreseen and provided for in some manner. In short, the raid on Harpers Ferry was not the foolhardy frenzy of a crackpot, but the product of years of thought, study, and conclusion. If the capacity for sound instrumental reasoning is an argument against madness, John Brown was eminently sane. He knew, of course, that all the planning in the world couldn't guarantee the raid's success, so he kept the worst-case scenario in mind. If his band was overcome by the enemy's superior numbers, he said, quote, I could but be killed, and I had no better use for my life but to lay it down in the cause of the slave. The first to vouch for Brown's sanity was Henry Wise, the governor of Virginia, who interviewed Brown shortly after he was captured. Wise wrote, they are mistaken who take him to be a madman. He is a bundle of the best nerves I ever saw, cut and thrust and bleeding and in bonds. He is a man of clear head, of courage, fortitude, and simple ingenuousness. He is cool, collected, and indomitable, and it is but just to him to say he was humane to his prisoners. He inspired me with great trust in his integrity as a man of truth. His men, too, are like him. So Brown was perfectly capable of calculating the best means to his ends. But what most bewildered observers was less a shaky grasp of instrumental rationality than a willingness to defy it altogether. Risking your life in order to save others cannot be explained instrumentally, however many evolutionary psychologists may try. Compare reactions to Brown's raid and the reaction to Nat Turner, a slave who led a much wilder and bloodier rebellion in Virginia some 20 years earlier. Turner was caught, tried, and executed, but he was never accused of insanity. Despite the efforts of Southern propagandists to argue that those they enslaved were content with their lot, fear of slave rebellion went deep. Even Southerners knew at bottom that every slave hated his bondage. Several slave uprisings had already occurred. Rebelling against one's own slavery, therefore, seemed perfectly rational. Rebelling against a condition with no direct impact on oneself or one's kin, by contrast, seemed crazy. In fact, as the following lectures will make clear, my own heroes are all universalists, those who took risks to uphold the fundamental dignity of all humankind. To be sure, taking a stand for one's own liberation requires courage, the willingness to reject a measure of comfort, to risk everything for freedom. And history is hardly lacking in nationalist heroes who did the same for their countries. Yet the further the distance from our own interests, the more admirable a hero will be. Few people will call you heroic if you risk your life to save your own child. Indeed, should you fail to do so, many will find you contemptible. Risking your life to save a child you never met is another story. The most remarkable heroes act over promptings of instinct and tribal loyalties. As Kant and Thoreau saw, defying all the claims of nature is the purest expression of freedom. According to a conception of rationality, which assumes self-interest to be the only end towards which we can sensibly strive, Brown's behavior was incomprehensible. But as Kant taught us, practical reason may flout every material interest, including the desire for life itself. It's not hard to hear echoes of Kant in Thoreau's critique of the newspaper's trial coverage, and of course, the transcendentalists were all neo-Kantians. Thoreau wrote, one writer says that Brown's peculiar monomania made him dreaded by the Missourians as a supernatural being. Sure enough, a hero in the midst of cowards is always so dreaded. He shows himself superior to nature. Brown's life called common conceptions of reason themselves into question. No one saw this quicker than Thoreau. Quote, "I hear another ask, Yankee-like, what will he gain by it? As if he expected to fill his pockets by this enterprise. Such a one has no idea of gain but in this worldly sense. If he does not get a new pair of boots or a vote of thanks, it must be a failure. But he won't gain anything by it. Well, no, I don't suppose he could get 4 and 6 pence a day for being hung, taken the year round. But then he stands a chance to save a considerable part of his soul, and such a soul which you do not. No doubt you can get more in your market for a quart of milk than a quart of blood, but that is not the market that heroes carry their blood to." End quote. As one historian commented, the assumption that Brown was a lunatic began to recede during the civil rights movement after freedom riders showed that other white people were willing to die for a liberation that had no particular relation to their own self-interest. These were my childhood heroes, Andrew Goodman, James Chaney, and Mickey Schwerner, who were murdered during Freedom Summer in 1964 and thereby basically forced the passing of the voting rights law. Alas, such sacrifices are seldom remembered. There are very many Americans, I guess under the age of 50, who have no idea who these heroes were. As the economist Robert Frank wrote, "The flint-eyed researcher fears no greater humiliation than to have called some action altruistic, only to have a more sophisticated colleague later demonstrate that it was self-serving. This fear surely helps for the extraordinary volume of ink behavioral scientists have spent trying to unearth selfish motives for seemingly self-sacrificing acts." So it's not surprising that a 2020 television series, mini-series devoted to Brown, reverts to the caricature which paints him as an impulsive lunatic, a righteous lunatic, perhaps mad just the same. It's awful. If you see a television, I can't bring myself to watch all 5 versions. I was so disgusted by the first 3 that I forced myself to watch, although they give a pretty awful picture of Frederick Douglass as well. But it shows, and I think this is because of our understanding of human reason and human decency, that many people still think Brown was mad. Takes a lot of money to produce a 5-part television series with major stars. So Emerson's speech, Courage, is as important today as it was in 1859. He rued a world turned upside down. I wish we might have health enough to know virtue when we see it, and not cry with the fools, madman, when a hero passes. Now, is the fact that Brown's mission was ultimately successful a testament to his sanity? Writing to Engels in January 1860, Karl Marx said, "The most significant thing happening in the world today is a slave movement. On the one hand in America, initiated by the death of Brown, on the other hand in Russia." According to Frederick Douglass, John Brown began the war that ended slavery and made this a free republic. Until this blow was struck, the prospect for freedom was dim, shadowy, uncertain. John Brown's testimony put the South itself on trial. Northern public opinion shifted dramatically towards abolition. And watching as Northern sympathies for him exploded, Southerners moved rapidly to support secession from the Union. The courage that impressed the North terrified the South, which began to form the militias that would be the base of the Confederate Army. Southern newspapers printed cartoons of Brown dressed as Satan. I'm sorry, this is a bit hard to read. I couldn't get you a better image. And they wrote poems in which the devil offers his own seat in hell to Brown and Lincoln. Despite Lincoln's best efforts to distance himself from Brown, Southerners routinely identified them. As one wrote, "Now that the black radical Republicans have power, I suppose they will Brown us all." Lincoln's care to denounce him during the 1860 election was a matter of conviction as well as tactics. But it was Lincoln who had come to put Brown's last words into action and even to amplify them in his second inaugural address, which ends like this: "If God wills that the war continue until all the wealth piled by the bondsman's 250 years of unrequited toil shall be sunk, and until every drop of blood drawn with the lash shall be paid by another drawn with the sword, as was said 3,000 years ago, so still it must be said that the judgments of the Lord are true and righteous altogether." That's Lincoln's second inauguration. W.B. Du Bois wrote that Brown did more to shake the foundations of slavery than any single thing that ever happened in America. On the eve of his execution, the Springfield Republican wrote, "No event could so deepen the moral hostility of the people of the free states to slavery as this execution. This is not because the acts of Brown are generally approved, for they are not. It is because the nature and spirit of this man are seen to be great and noble." Today, our judgment of Brown is not only affected by his character, but by the fact that most historians now agree with Lincoln that slavery could not have been ended without the war in which Brown fired the first shots. But if success can't be a sufficient reason to judge a deed heroic, it also can't be necessary. Otherwise, we'd be forced to deny the unquestionable heroism of those who failed. What Bernard Williams called moral luck is not in our hands. No one factor was responsible for the ultimate success of Brown's efforts to defeat slavery. The fire he lit was ripe for kindlings, and many things came together to fan the flames. But one idea stands out in Brown's 1851 address to the League of Gileadites, an organization he helped found to protect fugitive slaves in Massachusetts. Urging them to self-defense, he recalled the example of Joseph Cinque, an enslaved African who led a successful mutiny on a Portuguese slave ship. Caught by the U.S. Navy and brought to trial for mutiny and murder, he was defended by the former U.S. President John Quincy Adams and eventually exonerated by the U.S. Supreme Court, which ruled that the mutiny was justified self-defense. And here's what Brown said about Cinque. "Nothing so charms the American people as personal bravery. Witness the case of Cinque of everlasting memory on board the Amistad. The trial for life of one bold and to some extent successful man for defending his rights in good earnest would arouse more sympathy throughout the nation than the accumulated wrongs and sufferings of more than 3 million of our submissive colored population. We need not mention the Greeks struggling against the oppressive Turks, the Poles against the Russians, to prove this." African Americans, Brown continued, would have more white supporters than they imagined could they show this kind of example in defense of their rights. These examples inspire more action than descriptions of suffering. To be sure, the testimony of victims can produce compassion, since oppression always relies on dehumanizing its victims. Portraying victims' humanity is crucial. Carlyle is only one thinker of the time who depicted Jews, Irish, and Black people as cockroaches. Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin moved public opinion not only by describing the torments of the enslaved, but by depicting their capacities for kindness, generosity, and principle, virtues slaveholders thought they did not possess. Pity and empathy can be spurs to action, but alone they rarely inspire. For among the human qualities we most value is dignity. Before the Civil War, blacks were not only thought to be crude and immoral, but as craven and cowardly, an image which endured in Northern debates over allowing free blacks to enroll in the Union Army. Like Conway, the 6 black men who died in the raid at Harpers Ferry revealed a dignity that belied Southern stereotypes of degraded subhumans, as the white men belied the Southern image of Yankees as timid traitors. Is it shame, or rather pride, shame's opposite, that makes us want to be a hero when we see one? No explanation has yet described the mechanism by which heroes inspire us to emulate them, but we know that they do. As Thoreau wrote after Brown's execution, the living North, was suddenly all transcendental. It went behind the human law, it went behind the apparent failure, and recognized eternal justice and glory. Brown, said Thoreau, needed no praise from others, but he exhorted his listeners to praise nonetheless. He said, "Do yourselves the honor of recognizing him." Thank you. You know, the funny thing that I probably should say, I did mention this horrible movie. I've probably told you the story in such a way, especially for those of you who don't know it, and maybe even for those of you who do, that it will all seem very obvious. Actually, what I'm saying about Brown is really not accepted by many people who know. That is, there are more people who think that he was either mad or a terrorist, more intelligent people, than think he was, as I think, a hero.
Great. Well, thank you so much. Thank you very much, Professor Neiman, Susan, if I may call you that, for such a wonderful lecture with such stunning and incisive images. So it was definitely worth waiting that extra time so that we could get that in place. Just a few announcements. So as I'm sure you all know, but I'll say that anyway, Professor Neiman will continue her lecture series here on Monday evening next week, the 9th of May, at the same time as 5:30 p.m. And that lecture will be on the topic of George Eliot, Heroes Without Faith. I'm looking forward to that a great deal. Just a reminder to all of you that there's the blog with an online discussion throughout the fortnight of the series on our Gifford Lectures blog, led by Victoria Turner of New College. And to follow and contribute to the discussion, you can access the blog via the Gifford Lectures web pages. And of course, you're also warmly invited to the Gifford seminar held on Wednesday, the 11th of May from 1 till 2 p.m. at Rainey Hall in New College. Again, details can be found on the Gifford website. So do you want to take a seat?
Maybe sitting down is not a bad idea.
Yeah.
Let's see.
Well, I mean, I don't mind. I've not been standing for.
Probably a good idea.
But I imagine if I'd been giving that lecture, well, I couldn't have given that lecture. But if I had been given, I think I could have mentioned Dred Scott, and that would have been about it.
That's not. I mean, I realize this is not your country, so I have no idea how much of this is familiar to people or not. But I must say. It wasn't initially familiar to me.
Okay.
In vague outlines, but I had to go into the story. And do you know what else really disturbs me? So the philosophy department at Harvard is called Emerson Hall. And there's an over life-size statue of Ralph Waldo Emerson. It's not a story that, as far as I know, anyone in Emerson Hall knows, because I've asked. I would bet that my departed teacher, John Rawls, knew it because he knew quite a lot about the Civil War and Lincoln, and there's no way that you can really study the Civil War without knowing something about John Brown. But philosophers most philosophers tend not to pay a lot of attention to history. And so this is not known. Even in, this place, if you've ever been there, has an aura with Emerson kind of presiding over it at the entrance.
Can we run a couple of minutes over because we started late? Yeah. Okay. So, but we'll. I just wanted to open it up and ask for any questions. There's a roving mic. Yes, please, just there. If you want to introduce yourself, that's grand. If you don't want to, and then Alison, who needs no introduction. In a minute. Yeah, there's a question and then.
Thank you for a wonderful lecture. I really enjoyed it. I wanted to ask about Brown's concept of equality. Was it equality of all men, and was it equal but different, or equal on the same terms? And also, if I may, I'm curious about his ideas on role of women in society.
You know what? First of all, it was equality of everybody. I mean, we weren't yet at the stage where the issue was, how do you reconcile equality with cultural differences? We were simply at the stage where the view was some groups of people are, less virtuous and talented than others. He was not bad about women. It was extraordinary. He said, which was very unusual at the time, he sent his girls to school, which was normally not done. And there was one coeducational school in Concord, Massachusetts, run basically by the Transcendentalists. Not all of them sent their own girls to school, but Brown sent his girls to school. And I read the letter in which, his daughter talks about taking some of the work off his wife. It was a division of labor in a farm where, it tended to be the case where, that the women took care of the inside and the men took care of the outside. But, staying up with sick babies so his wife could get a break, not bad for 1850 something or other.
Thank you. That was wonderful. Thank you very much. In the criticisms of him as a person that came over from what you were saying was that either he was mad or he was a terrorist or both. And you've shown how he was not mad. On the question of, well, two questions. One is, where are we on the question of the constitutional status of slavery and slave owning? I mean, did the Declaration of Independence actually allow slavery or did it not? Mm-hmm. In which case, was he a terrorist or not? Was he outside the law? And secondly, I mean, we would expect that in a situation like that, nowadays, people would undermine his character, undermine his personal qualities. Was there criticism directed at that? Because he seems to have been just wonderful as a human being as well as everything else.
Let me answer your second question first. Yes, of course, that's exactly what the criticism was directed towards, to try and undermine what he had done by describing him as crazy. And honestly, when I started thinking about Brown, I was on the fence. I didn't know, So you have to do some reading. But there are a lot of accounts of people who actually knew him and wrote long personal tributes to him and descriptions of him, and people who made philosophical arguments, didn't know him well, but they'd met him, like Thoreau and Emerson. So yes, the attempt was to undermine what he'd done by calling him a crazy fanatic. Where was slavery at the point? Oh boy, the Founding Fathers. It was the most debated issue at the Constitutional Convention because the Southern Founding Fathers, of course, wanted to preserve slavery. And the reason we have the Constitution begins with a preamble that says we're committed to preserving life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The Southerners wanted life, liberty, and property. And there was a huge fight to get that left out of the Constitution. Interestingly enough, they were very sleazy, I'm afraid, the Southern founding fathers, because they wanted, for the purposes of representation in Congress, the House of Representatives is determined, you get representatives proportioned to your population. So the more population you have, the more power you have in Congress. The compromise, they wanted to include the people they enslaved for the purposes of having more representation, although of course it was inconceivable they were going to be allowed to vote, much less live freely. So the compromise was to count enslaved people as 3/5 of a person. So what Brown was doing was absolutely outside of the law, no question about it. And as I said, I went over this very quickly. It had been the case that although there was a tiny bit of personal slavery in some northern states, basically slavery was abolished in the North and permitted in the South. But this whole battle over Kansas and the extension of slave states was attempting to get a majority of states supporting slavery. But he was completely breaking the law, no question about it.
Okay, we've only got time for there's lots of questions popping up now, but I think that we're running out of time rapidly. So we've got two more who've caught my eye, a gentleman with the microphone and then somebody behind, and then after that we'll have to call that a day. So
Hi.
keep it fairly short as well.
I was just wondering, with John Brown's use of Joseph Chinke, I believe is how you pronounce it, and knowing that his plan would possibly fail, do you think he may have used his death as a, I guess, symbol to possibly get more slave rebellions started, but also using white Americans to help fight with the slaves?
Yes, I think his death was his plan B, I mean, which is an odd way to describe it. His initial plan, and Chinque survived. I mean, Chinque was actually freed by the Supreme Court and he went back to Africa, which is quite unusual. And the reason I love that quote goes back to my first lecture about the comparative importance of victims and heroes. And Brown's view was that heroes actually inspire more people. So he initially wanted this sort of low-key anti-slavery republic in the mountains, which would grow in strength and undermine slavery by supporting slaves who were leaving and, making realize, you pay $1,000 for another human being, you're not going to have it long because he or she will leave. So that was his plan A. But yes, the plan B was, if he's executed, it would inspire both black and white people, as it did.
Thank you so much for your fantastic lecture. I was just wondering if you can elaborate a bit more on the idea that a hero is not necessarily inspired by self-interest, and the notion that some people, and I would say critical theory in particular, see some value in the victim, the oppressed, like taking responsibility for freedom and for the emancipation of people, and if that is also heroic as well, taking responsibility for that and stop being only a passive object and becoming an active agent as well. So whether perhaps in this idea of the moral complexity of the hero, there is also place for self-interest as well, a victim that takes the place of and takes the responsibility of achieving her own emancipation is also a hero as well. So thank you so much.
Yeah. So, of course, we know in all kinds of cases of oppressed populations that there are people who are too afraid to risk anything and will stay in some form of slavery rather than take any chances. It goes all the way back to the Bible, to the Old Testament, where some of the children of Israel are, complaining that they'd rather go back to the flesh pots of Egypt rather than wander around in the desert. So yes, to a certain extent, taking your life in your own hands and standing up for self-determination is certainly a heroic act. But I think at least I admire people just slightly more who stand up for something other than their own liberation and fight as well for the liberation of other people. And frankly, if we look at the war in Ukraine, which I began with, whenever I began, Monday, I think, we're admiring Zelensky. Now, of course, this is a nationalist war. I mean, the part of what is maintaining the Ukrainian resistance is sheer nationalism, and there's some rather unsavory Ukrainian nationalists who are involved in the fighting, no question about that. But the reason why Zelensky is managing to inspire people and why so many countries are showing solidarity is because it's not just for the cause of Ukraine that, they're standing up for and the rhetoric is appealing to. It's the cause of freedom and against aggression, against unprovoked aggression. And that's an idea, not simply a nationality.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Professor Neiman. Thank you to the audience for bearing with us when we had our technical problems at the beginning, but I think we managed to produce that. And thank you to those who've asked questions. They've been most interesting, really brought out some very interesting responses. I'm sure everyone's looking forward very much to the resumption of the Gifford lectures next week. I certainly am. And perhaps we can express our appreciation in the usual way.